Okay, so we're ready to get started here. We have our next contestant is Renata Southard. Renata is going to take us to Baltimore, where she's going to talk about connections and strategies for continuity in Baltimore. Her thesis committee, her chair was Carl Dupuy, Carl Bogle, and myself, Renata.
Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking my committee. Without their guidance and encouragement, this project would have never developed the way it did. And I'd also like to thank my husband and my family and all of my colleagues for your support. And with that, I'll get started. Cultivating connection, strategies for continuity in Baltimore City. This thesis explores options for a site in Baltimore that could be better physically and socially connected. But before I get to the site, I'd like to begin with this quote from Henry David Thoreau. The ability to see the world through someone else's eyes might be our greatest tool as a designer. Empathy-based design uses a process of research, site visits, observations, interviews to uncover latent needs. Those needs not being met by current designs. In the summer of 2016, the city of Baltimore used this method. They sent volunteers out into communities to collect information from residents to better understand how neighborhoods could become more sustainable. Through that data collection campaign, Baltimore uncovered its own latent need. Residents overwhelmingly responded that they wanted access to parks, safe spaces, and green infrastructure. But Baltimore doesn't currently have a plan that could act as green infrastructure or comprehensive park network. But the administration wasn't discouraged. Instead, they set their sights higher and they developed Baltimore Network Plan, released in May of 2017. Currently, the plan is a diagram. These spaces have been identified as potential spaces to be developed, but the development has yet to occur. The way that the plan works is that it identifies vacant spots throughout neighborhoods in Baltimore City, shown here in red, that could be reverse engineered into green spaces, parks, a connected loop. Many of these places have not been developed. North Avenue is slated as an important corridor for this network plan. My site, located on North Avenue, is an attempt to develop one of those places on the Green Network Plan in more detail. The reason I selected my site was because it sits at the intersection of three very distinct neighborhoods. Station North feels fun and industrial. Reservoir Hill feels like an extension of its neighbor to the north, Druid Hill Park. And Bolton Hill feels upright and a little bit more formal. To understand how these neighborhoods got their distinct characteristics, we need to go back in history. In the Industrial Revolution, mills came to Baltimore City, and they set up outside the grid and used the Jones Falls to power their operations. Each of these mills set up their own grid system in alignment with the Jones Falls, and those grid systems found their way into the city. You can see the neighborhoods outlined here: Station North, Reservoir Hill, and Bolton Hill. In 1907, MICA came to the neighborhood. The Maryland Institute College of Arts started with one building, and over the next 110 years, added several more. These buildings kept up with the times. They reflect the building materials of the period that they were built in, and the glassy buildings stand out from their brick neighbors. As the neighborhood continued to densify, the city saw a need to build housing. In the 1970s, senior housing complex added 357 units to the neighborhood, and that housing complex now houses several hundred residents, senior residents on a fixed income. Finally, the Jones Falls Trail improvement has brought weekend visitors and outdoor enthusiasts and lots of bicyclists. So, understanding the scope, industry brought jobs and working class families who put down roots and had children and have remained in the neighborhood. MICA brought students, faculty, and artists. The families had kids. The kids have needs that need to be addressed. The building brought senior citizens, and then the trail brought weekend visitors. Through a data collection of my own, I started to identify a program that was in demand in the neighborhood. This diagram organizes that program. For instance, senior citizens used medical care a lot, but education very little. Everybody wanted parks and green space, though. So after reviewing the program that was in the neighborhood, I discovered that the programs that needed to be added to the neighborhood were medical and fitness. And there were some program that was available in the neighborhood but was difficult to access, either due to site conditions, to steep topography, or it was just not very visible. In an attempt to organize my strategy, I looked at where the density occurred. So you have density here at the senior housing and density on the MICA campus. And then existing amenities within the neighborhood. So these are things that people want to access, including existing larger transportation networks, a light rail station, and bicycle lanes. But the barriers that I mentioned earlier keep people from crossing over this gap. So we have steep topography that runs through the site, the Jones Falls, a body of water, an expressway, and then finally North Avenue, which is a 6-lane wide arterial road. My strategy is to connect all of those spaces. So navigate the topography, add bicycle and pedestrian lanes, and connect the two sides of this community. The program utilizes an existing building and demolishes 2 buildings on site. That program will be replaced in the new building. The other thing it does is it adds bridges, pathways, and vertical circulation. As I mentioned, I demolished the existing streetcar museum, which was a shed building, and there is a bicycle nonprofit in the neighborhood that's currently looking for new warehouse space and office space. I added a second level to the streetcar museum with a gallery space and office space for the bicycle nonprofit. I also added some sports and fitness, retail along the street front, a new plaza that acts like an outdoors room, cafe, and a Jones Falls Welcome Center to start to identify the neighborhood with the existing amenity. There's also community space and space for after-school programs. On the third level, I've got a community room that would allow for large gatherings and meetings. And then medical program in the existing building along with sports and fitness on the other side. And then finally I've added a gym to the to the existing building and smaller medical spaces on the other side of that building, and classrooms for after-school programs and community programs. And more classrooms. And with that, I'd like to move to my boards. And the way I'm going to finish telling this story is through the users that I introduced you to earlier. The involved resident takes public transit to work and arrives at the light rail station, makes her way across the new pedestrian bridge and up the terraced rain garden stair into her new apartment building. Later, she'll attend a community meeting in the new community building. Next, we have the Micah student, who's so committed to his painting that he wants to help the kids. And he's going to volunteer in an after-school program. And he comes from Micah, rides his bike across in the new bicycle lane, and arrives in the plaza. He stops to get a cup of coffee in the cafe, and then heads into the building, where he teaches an art class. Finally, you have the school kids who attend that art class. And they're on foot. They travel along the new protected, tree-lined streets of North Avenue, and they come through the tunnel into the plaza, and after attending the art class, go over and play basketball in the gym. Next, we have the senior citizen, Mrs. Collins, who lives in the high-rise here, and she has a much more labored journey. And as she moves towards her destination, which is the doctor's offices here, there's a low wall that she can sit on underneath shade trees. So her rhythm is a lot more staccato. She doesn't have this fluid emotion. And then finally, the weekend visitors, who ride their bikes from Mount Washington down the Jones Falls Trail. They visit the Streetcar Museum and the new Jones Falls Welcome Center. Sometimes they go into the gallery. This project was less about the building and more about making urban form, about not standing out in a neighborhood that already has a lot of object buildings. The project is really about how a building can connect people with each other and with the amenities in a community. And with that, I'd like to open it up to comments. Questions? The cantilever, that's the gallery space that's attached to the community building. And that really developed. I had studied ways to navigate the two sides of the stream bank. Some of my earlier versions started with a tall bridge this way. But
comments. First of all, I really appreciate your thoughtfulness to the community and your sort of identifying people who are going to come from different places, they come from different places, they use this, what's going to hopefully be a community center in different ways. But I have a couple of questions, mostly specifically about the existing building. Once you deal with an existing building, this is my own opinion, this is what I tell my own thesis students, if you deal with an existing building in an architecture thesis, the thesis becomes, I don't think it's on, but I'll talk loud and pretend it's on. In a sense, the thesis becomes the conversation between old and new. And we have to set up the terms of that engagement. There's always this investigation of, is this a Carlo Scarpa-like relationship between old and new? Is it an homage? Is it a parasite? Is it a twin? And I'm having a really hard time understanding your attitude toward the existing building, why this one was saved and the other ones weren't, and how you actually are building with the existing building. What parts are new? What's the attitude about the structure?
Okay.
What's your position?
So I was very gentle with the building. I left the structure in place. I left the building as is and repacked the program a little bit. I picked up on the proportions of the existing building for the new buildings. I used them as regulating lines. I used the proportions of the new windows, or the proportions of the old windows to make the new windows.
Let me be more specific. So is that a new roof, the big sort of
Oh yes.
vaulted roof?
Right, so the gym is an addition.
So how is that structured relative to the old building?
So, well,
is it bearing on the old structure?
yeah, so it goes down, that was pretty early in the project. It bears down on the old structure.
Think the old structure is ready for that?
Probably not.
And I want to sort of get to know that building because I have a feeling, again, your commitment to the community is really strong. And the idea that that building is a landmark probably to these people who've passed by there. And that would be probably one of the most fraught parts of this project when you go through the community design review is what are you doing to our building and how are you going to do it? And ultimately it does come down to a question of detail. How are you actually touching that building? How do you let the new part not destroy the old part? And so if there's something that I feel like is a loose thread here, a lot of it actually has to do with deciding really what the architectonic relationship is to that building. And this is sort of a comment on the representation, which we haven't really talked about in any of the other ones. There's a curious inadvertent symbolism to how big this image is and that it's the aerial that's undermining your storyline about being at ground level with the community. In a sense, you could say, look, the aerial carries a certain messages when the aerial is used as the omniscient view of the architect or centralized planning, and you're making it very clear that that's not the world you're in. And so this drawing is contradicting you. And so I'd be careful about how big it is and then think of sort of how that part of it gets bigger.
So I also appreciate the thoughtfulness that you have brought to kind of how this building is going to be used by the community, and I think that drives your decisions about program. And I hear you in terms of your intent was to focus on the kind of urban character rather than sort of the specific architecture necessarily. I feel like I want to know more. That said, I feel like I want to know more and understand more about the facades and the buildings, how they come together and how they interact. I appreciate what you said about the connection, but I sort of wonder whether, is it north? The main road with the bridge is probably, a major connector between the two sides of Jones Falls. Are people really going to come sort of meander through your plaza and come down across the pedestrian bridge and then come back up on the other side? And you haven't explored, that bridge kind of comes down in the drawing, gets cut, kind of ghosted on that side. I wonder what you haven't really connected completely into the other side of the neighborhood. If the boulevard is really important, the sense of your plaza and park is more kind of terracing on roofs of buildings and stepping down toward the Jones Falls, and not very engaged with the boulevard and the main street. And I think also you could have explored the existing building. What was that building like? And are there big spaces in that existing building? And how could that have been an entrance off of the street in through some archival space with this sort of real gritty kind of old character? It feels instead like you've used that building to kind of put, it's a kind of programmatic exercise. I mean, you've used that building to put some of the program that's the important generator of the sense of community that you could have thought more, I think, about the spatial quality of that sense of community. So I think that's a kind of step for further thinking about your thesis is what are the spaces like in your project, and how might those be designed to support the community?
You know, in the Olympics, they do diving. They score a difficulty of the dive as well as the styling of the dive. You have a site that is from hell. This is the most complex urban condition you can imagine. Railroads curving off, highways sliding overhead, rivers running underneath. It's amazing. I'm astonished that you can make any sense of this whatsoever. And in your vignettes, where I think things have been really successful, there's some of the vignettes of your landscaping are really terrific. The 3 landscaping pieces, not the interior so much, because I'm not really judging the architectural result of the buildings, but the 3 landscaping pieces are really sensitively designed, really nicely scaled. And if they all add up and you can get from one point of the site to another, good for you. But there needs to be a drawing of all of that, how all of these landscaping pieces come together. You've got a nice little axometric slice, but I'd like to see how they all join up in one of the plans. But I have to say, I've never seen a site more difficult to tackle as a site. What was the motivation?
Well, I knew that I wanted to be on North Avenue, and I wanted to address a site that I saw had real potential for benefiting the neighborhood.
I think your instincts for social renovation and rehabilitation of an area are terrific. But this may be one you have to say, it can't be done. Partially because the millions of dollars that would be spent building all of these infrastructural connections might well be better spent somewhere else, doing something else. Not that you're wrong, but they have a quality of an old Greek site that has been sculpted out of a mountain in Perini, and you find the temple of the gods at the top or something, a procession up to it. But, I mean, there's some terrific moments to it. It's just that I can't imagine being on that down on the riverside, looking up at the other side of the highway, and having a train go by in the other direction and say, what do I do? Where do I go? How do I get out of here? It'd be scary. Anyway, terrific job. Thank you.
No, I think you managed to create the richness of an urban site, but with a sort of village atmosphere, in which it's very important the change of levels and the differentiation of the strategies. You know, the park, like stepping down, maybe some important staircase. Maybe less like a shopping mall, could have been an open staircase that goes down to the river. Some buildings that are like towers, and therefore they become the focus of the site. And I agree, I think these vignettes are very powerful. At the same time, the architecture itself, sometimes it's timid, maybe a little bit. Like this building here, it's not very clear what this brown thing is. It's elevators, they are civic tower in some way. Yeah. So I would try to emphasize more the architecture itself, because I think you did quite an interesting job in terms of connections and so on. And maybe the entry from this boulevard into the side is a little timid as well, or it could be a little stressed. And the same is very important is the square, let's put it this way, on the top, that you say, oh, that's just for the old people going to the, from the high rise. No, that's the major part of the site, that's where you enter. And therefore then you find your way around. But I think you did a great job in terms really of articulation, complexity, and dealing with all these issues of circulation and hierarchy of buildings, which is quite strong and interesting.
In this world of look at me architecture, I think it takes a lot of courage to do a project that is more of connecting with the community than it is just simply creating architecture that glorifies, other impulses. I actually had the opposite reaction to the picture, which is interesting. And I really was fascinated the way you were explaining it, because I saw it as about the community. I saw the building being at the center of a larger framework. And I admire the fact that you picked a site that is as convoluted as this one. Because frankly, that's what we do. We don't often get buildings or sites that are perfect. We get the fringes and the terrible things. And some of this transcends architecture. It actually goes into the use of the building and how the building is actually developed in terms of its potential for retail, for all kinds of different things that can happen there that can be a catalyst for change in that community. So with that, I have to say I really enjoyed it. Being an architect and being in a thesis presentation, I always wanted to see a little bit more of the development of the building, how things go together, how that roof is supported, how you actually reuse an existing facility. Those are big questions. But I appreciate the work done here so far. Thank you.
I struggled when I first was listening to you, looking at the drawings, why I immediately couldn't grab onto what I wanted to talk about, but I think it's so well executed, so clearly documented in a kind of thorough, professional manner, but at the same time, it did feel a little safe. I wasn't feeling challenged, and I couldn't figure out what that was, and maybe it is because we don't get inside enough. I think what feels a little safe to me is that the program feels kind of neatly compartmentalized, and I wonder if there's ways to take the building you have drawn and just represent it a little differently, maybe through a section perspective, really get in there and look at how the different uses kind of affect one another. How can one person in the senior center experience or see people in another portion of the building, and try to kind of create almost this little community within the larger community. I worry that it's almost holding back just a little bit in that kind of interaction. But again, the complexity of the site, the way you've worked down the hill, you've made it look easy, which I know it's not. So in that way, I definitely commend you.
Yeah, so I rarely respond to the actual building design. I'll let all the really great designers down there do that. I tend to, look at things from the planning perspective, and just a comment on some of the diagrams, because I do a lot of that for college and university campus planning that I do, and many times it's diagrams I'm looking at for the process strategy down here. Just some advice, maybe when you're graphically representing those things, to represent North Avenue as a dashed line as the same size of line physically as the edge of the Greenbelt and or 83 or the waterfront. They all look the same, but they're all very different.
Right.
And so one of the strategies we have is actually draw at the width of what it actually takes up. Because to scale, if you were to cover up 83 North Avenue in red, as wide as those pieces of concrete are, all of a sudden that diagram would read a lot different, right? Trying to get MICA students across is going to be much more difficult. If the river is X wide, draw it as wide as it is in blue or different colors. Graphically think about it. Grab a couple of landscape books and look at different ways of graphically representing things would be one suggestion. I like how you use the people that come from a variety of different perspectives and how they get to your site and or leave it and get back. A lot of you can't just assume that everybody comes to your site all down North Avenue. They're all, depending on who they are, they come from different directions. And, what time of day is it? Morning, afternoon, evening, they're coming from lunch, they're going back. those patterns all change depending on the time of day, right? So I think going through and thinking about it in that way is really fascinating. My other comment, and once again, it is very convoluted because you got a lot of stuff going on the site. I'd be interested to see, and we talked about, global warming. I mentioned earlier about some of the floods we've had in Texas, right? The last, and I was showing these guys pictures at lunch today of some of the floods in Texas we've had in the hill country, and I can tell you, you can't go by the 100-year floodplain anymore. Look at the 500-year floodplain. That's what we had twice this year. It's crazy. And so a 500-year floodplain probably would wipe out most of this site. So you got to be careful that we just don't take the 100-year floodplain as gospel anymore, right? It's changing. And two, if you're actually to design this, I'd put on one of the best landscape firms I can find in the country to help you, knit this thing into this greater Jones Falls, because that's going to be a little trickier problem. But other than that, it's great, amazing problem.
I want to reiterate what Chris, what Chris said about the floodplain site. Baltimore now, you can't build below the 500-year flood line anymore. That changed a couple years ago. But it got me thinking that it would be so interesting to use this project because the Jones Falls will flood. It does flood a lot. And there have been some pretty dramatic things in the last few years. But to use this, again, this is not what your intention was, but it's part of the sustainability plan anyway, the resiliency, the climate resiliency, to use this whole site as some kind of mechanism. And in addition to what you're doing, but that it becomes some way of absorbing or mitigating the flood forces or something. That could be pretty cool.
I want to make one last comment. If any project, any site needs a model, this is it. And it's a challenge to build a model of that site, and the challenge, in some sense, represents the challenge of building on the site. And I think when we talk about, you should build a model, visions of chipboard fly through your head and the laser cutter, and it's like, yeah. But a model can be embedded with all sorts of other information. That is, it challenges us to figure out how to represent and model flood stages. Or how do you represent existing buildings versus new buildings? How do you actually show what's been there over the last couple hundred years? So when faculty sort of say, you should build a model, think of the model also as an exploration of the things that can't otherwise be seen. It can be an X-ray into other things, but the three-dimensional quality of this site really demands three-dimensional representation.
I wanted to ask a question that builds on some earlier comments. Do you see your building as a gateway to the park, or do you see it as connecting the two sides of Jones Falls?
I see it really, I guess, can I say that it serves two functions? Can I say that it does both? Because I really feel like these two pieces of the building are the gateway to the park. So you have almost an entrance that allows you to navigate from the neighborhood into this new park system, and it puts you out into the landscape in a dramatic way. And then on the north-south sides of the building, it's more of like a connector to the neighborhood, so it's more about fitting it.
Okay, and the reason I think the model would be helpful to kind of understand the forms that you've created and the way you get from North Avenue into the building, into the little plaza you've created, and then down to the park. We're having even a section kind of through, all the way down to the Jones Falls and sort of up, into the building to see how those connections are made.
Right.
And I still think that this moment here, there's this energy that you've got, that you're taking people away from the street.
Yeah.
And the building is kind of turning itself inward. There's not enough enlivening of the streetscape along here. And even this building, which is the one that's facing out, or this corner of this building, aren't classy. They're not transparent. They're not outward looking. So that's why I wanted to kind of I wasn't sure if I was unfairly kind of judging that quality of it, and if your real intent was about bringing people down and experiencing the complexity of the section of the city and this interesting, even the history of the transportation network in Baltimore.
Yeah, well, and some of the design language came from that, and this idea about coming into the site and into the building and into the landscape. So I think it didn't quite get flushed out. If I had another year to spend on this project, I think I could fill that year.
Well, that form that candidate is an interesting expression of the park.
It's a great design move. A project you might want to check sometime was by Machado and Silvetti and Machado made did a competition for a stairway in Providence, Rhode Island, connecting Brown University downtown to the river. And it was the same analogous situation. What they did have to contend with was that railroad track that slices through there and basically ruins the site. I mean, I could live with a highway somehow crossing the river, but when you have the highway crossing the river and the railroad track and everything else, it gets pretty complex. But it's much more an Italian hill town with the ramparts of the old construction. You're building an edge to the city and negotiating a way down, which is what comes across in the drawings. But that Silvetti Machado project would be interesting, I think, as well.
Yeah, I'm unfamiliar with it, so thank you.
It was in a PA Design Award, God knows when, years ago. But it's an oldie but goldie. I'm sure they have it in their collection of work somewhere.
Right. I just want to be sure. Okay, I have to explain this. I did the 797 course, which is a preliminary part for these people, but now I'm only teaching one semester, so I handed them off to Brian Kelly. So I'm familiar with these projects. I try to restrain myself and not say anything. The focus here is on your project clearly, but what I know, of course, is that you started on the other side of the Jones Falls, did all this gigantic neighborhood analysis, et cetera, when I saw this, my first reaction was, oh, this is what you were trying to do. But I'm curious as to what it was that drove you from looking so intensely at that side of the area over to this side as a way to deal with whatever it was you were trying to get at.
Ren, can you put up your initial presentation and show that? The overall total plan.
Which?
About 15 slides in. That one right there.
This
That
one?
one right there. This is what Steve is talking about. She spent most of her time over here on the far left.
So, yeah, the initial analysis occurred here, and then at my last pro-thesis meeting, it was determined that I was going to switch sites. It was agreed upon. So I think what happened was I recognized that just about anything could happen on flat ground. And the real problem with connection, that's put a crosswalk in, make a complete street. The answer is already there. So I think what happened was I realized that I had a tougher problem to solve just a few blocks down the road. And the challenge became important to me. The challenge of having a really difficult site that really responded, because the design, I'm from a sculpture background, and I made dynamic sculptures, lots of metal work, lightly touching the ground because metal allows that. And at a certain point in this project, I was like, who designed this building? And I realized that what I was doing was I was trying to respond wholeheartedly to the context and leave my authorship out of it.
Okay, good. No, I really mean that, because early on, so just to expand a little bit, you recognized very early on that part of the difficulty here is this giant gap between these two really different neighborhoods. And to some degree, I think we as a faculty were going, oh my God, there's no, as you said, Bruce, a sight from hell, right? Sight from hell, And you spent quite a bit of time on the other portion to the left, looking at a lot of different strategies where the roadway, North Avenue, is so wide it sort of subdivides the neighborhoods. You spent a lot of time looking and feeling that condition. Meanwhile, sort of working your way down towards this site with some fear and reluctance. And so it's a great thing to, then sort of pony up to that big challenge and do it. So great. Congratulations.
This site, by contrast, really did allow you to explore that relationship between a city edge, and what does it mean to be in the city and along that street, and what is it, and what did it mean? What does it mean to be down, below the city in this landscape world? And the combination of those two realms, the distinction between those two realms, is actually a pretty interesting area for future exploration.
All right, it's my turn to talk. We got a few minutes. That's good. First of all, I think it's unfortunate that Ren is presenting here and nobody can really see the drawings over there because of how dark it is, and the lighting system has failed us, which is unfortunate. Second of all, I'd like to say that Ren is too polite and too nice and didn't point out certain drawings that she had that could have answered maybe some of the questions. I agree with Bruce that this is a site that's really, really exciting and difficult. I would call your attention to the terrific undercroft of Manchester, England, where there's 3 trains coming overhead with 2 highways, and it's created some phenomenal space because it's a reclaimed industrial area that really takes advantage of the site situation. I wish Ren had shown you the building that she is invading, because she's got the graphics, etc., and she's touching lightly, and she has widened the sidewalk. She can't widen the sidewalk on North Avenue, so she's invaded behind and created a loggia through the building, which engages the building. And the gymnasium is lightly touching the roof of the shed that's behind the landmark building. And had she shown that, maybe we could have had a discussion about how one inserts new and old and a whole dialogue. But her imagery, she struggled with brick versus stone, base versus top, existing warehouse buildings versus new granite retaining walls, etc. And some of her elevation studies, of course, are lost because they're over here in East Jesus someplace. Working with Ren has been terrific. She went to Scandinavia with Peter Noonan and I, in 2016. She saw a lot of architecture. She's a real urban designer, architect. She's getting there. She's getting there. But urban design, she did a magnificent job of attacking the site in an appropriate way to make it more usable given the existing situation that's up there now. And it's very light work. It's not aggressively, super urban design. It's nice, polite, infill, etc., at the right scales, etc. Her work in here, I think, has been very, very informative. She has a model. It's not complete. It's always an interactive model. she adds and subtracts from, etc. Showing it, would have been okay, but it's not going to answer all the questions, but at least it'll give you a sense of this three-dimensional puzzle that she had to solve. Ren is mature, dedicated, and has really done a very, very good job, particularly in one semester, given that she had concentrated here and over here rather than here until the second semester. So I think she should be applauded for a phenomenal amount of work to solve this problem at the scales that she actually addressed, both diagram, dimension, and detail. So thank you, Ren, for bringing this to the faculty. Thank you for all the comments. I think they're all valid and good. But then you have to get a little bit more attitude. You can't be so nice, You have to answer questions, and point out drawings like this section really shows, the promenade from Jones Falls up. In terms of acting, this is the throttle point right here. This is where the Jones Wall goes into a culvert, and the discharge is all the way down at the base in Baltimore, and this is going to flood. There's absolutely no doubt about it. She is well above the floodplain for 100 years, but 500 years, or whatever happened in Texas, there's nothing that's going to solve that problem, of course.
Well, and part of the reason that I put the warehouse and the streetcar museum on that first floor, the streetcars, and that stuff would not be ruined in a short flood, so it could get wet and it would ruin the building.
Okay. Anyway, thank you very much, and thank you for bringing the thesis to the faculty and students as well as our guests.
Thank you.